If you are joining us here for the conclusion of my reading of James Thurber's epic short story, The Catbird Seat, you already know why. The Friday night before the midterms, we really need to be going all election on the TV. And you already know the story so far. The briefest of recaps, then. Mr. Erwin Martin, the filing chief at the fictional F&S company in wartime New York City, as devised by James Thurber, has decided to rub out old Jean Barrows, the woman brought into the company by the boss, Mr. Fittweiler. She, as you know, is locked into a vocabulary consisting almost exclusively of the phrases used on the radio by play-by-play announcer of the Brooklyn Dodgers, the immortal Red Barber of WHN. Phrases like the catbird seat. This was originally published in 1945 in the Thurber Carnival. I'm reading from the American Library, Thurber, Writings and Drawings. Non-smoking teetotaler Martin has just arrived at Mrs. Barrows' home to commence murdering her as we conclude The Catbird Seat by James Thurber. Well, for God's sakes, look who's here, bawled Mrs. Barrows, and her braying laugh rang out like the report of a shotgun. He rushed past her like a football tackle, bumping her. Hey, quit shoving, she said, closing the door behind them. They were in her living room, which seemed to Mr. Martin to be lighted by 100 lamps. What's after you, she said. You're as jumpy as a goat. He found he was unable to speak. His heart was wheezing in his throat. Yes, he finally brought out. She was jabbering and laughing as she started to help him off with his coat. No, he said. I'll put it here. He took it off and put it on a chair near the door. Your hat and gloves, too, she said. You're in a lady's house. He put his hat on top of the coat. Mrs. Barrows seemed larger than he had thought. He kept his gloves on. I was passing by, he said. I recognized. Is there anyone here? She laughed louder than ever. No, she said. We're all alone. You're as white as a sheet, you funny man. Whatever has come over you? I'll mix you a toddy. She started toward a door across the room. Scotch and soda be all right? But say, you don't drink, do you? She turned and gave him her amused look. Mr. Martin pulled himself together. Scotch and soda will be all right, he heard himself say. He could hear her laughing in the kitchen. Mr. Martin looked quickly around the living room for a weapon. He had counted on finding one there. There were andirons and a poker and something in a corner that looked like an Indian club. None of them would do. It couldn't be that way. He began to pace around. He came to a desk. On it lay a metal paper knife with an ornate handle. Would it be sharp enough? He reached for it and knocked over a small brass jar. Stamps spilled out of it, and it fell to the floor with a clatter. Hey, Mrs. Barrows yelled from the kitchen. Are you tearing up the pea patch? Mr. Martin gave a strange laugh. Picking up the knife, he tried its point against his left wrist. It was blunt. It wouldn't do. When Mrs. Barrows reappeared carrying 2 highballs, Mr. Martin, standing there with his gloves on, became acutely conscious of the fantasy he had wrought. Cigarettes in his pocket, a drink prepared for him. It was all too grossly improbable. It was more than that. It was impossible. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a vague idea stirred, sprouted. For heaven's sakes, take off those gloves, said Mrs. Barrows. I always wear them in the house, said Mr. Martin. The idea began to bloom, strange and wonderful. She put the glasses on a coffee table in front of a sofa and sat on the sofa. Come over here, you odd little man, she said. Mr. Martin went over and sat beside her. It was difficult getting a cigarette out of the pack of Camels, but he managed it. She held a match for him, laughing. Well, she said, handing him his drink, this is perfectly marvelous. You with a drink and a cigarette. Mr. Martin puffed, not too awkwardly, and took a gulp of the highball. I drink and smoke all the time, he said. He clinked his glass against hers. Here's nuts to that old windbag Fittweiler, he said, and gulped again. The stuff tasted awful, but he made no grimace. Really, Mr. Martin, she said, her voice and posture changing. You are insulting our employer. Mrs. Barrows was now all special advisor to the president. I am preparing a bomb, said Mr. Martin, which will blow the old goat higher than hell. He had only had a little of the drink, which was not strong. It couldn't be that. Do you take dope or something? Mrs. Barrows asked coldly. Heroin, said Mr. Martin. I'll be coked to the gills when I bump that old buzzard off. Mr. Martin, she shouted, getting to her feet, that will be all of that. You must go at once. Mr. Martin took another swallow of the drink. He tapped his cigarette out in the ashtray and put the pack of Camels on the coffee table. Then he got up. She stood glaring at him. He walked over and put on his hat and coat. "Not a word about this," he said, and had laid an index finger against his lips. All Mrs. Barrows could bring out was, "Really?" Mr. Martin put his hand on the doorknob. "I'm sitting in the Catbird seat," he said. He stuck his tongue out at her and left. Nobody saw him go. Mr. Martin got to his apartment, walking well before 11. No one saw him go in. He had 2 glasses of milk after brushing his teeth, and he felt elated. It wasn't tipsiness, because he hadn't been tipsy. Anyway, the walk had worn off all the effects of the whiskey. He got in bed, read a magazine for a while. He was asleep before midnight. Mr. Martin got to the office at 8:30 the next morning, as usual. At 8:45, old Jean Barrows, who had never before arrived at work before 10, swept into his office. "I'm reporting to Mr. Fitweiler now," she shouted. "If he turns you over to the police, it's no more than you deserve." Mr. Martin gave her a look of shocked surprise. "I beg your pardon?" he said. Mrs. Barrows snorted and bounced out of the room, leaving Miss Peard and Joey Hart staring after her. "What's the matter with that old devil now?" asked Miss Peard. "I have no idea," said Mr. Martin, resuming his work. The other two looked at him and then at each other. Miss Peard got up and went out. She walked slowly past the closed door of Mr. Fitweiler's office. Mrs. Barrows was yelling inside, but she was not braying. Miss Peard could not hear what the woman was saying. She went back to her desk. 45 minutes later, Mrs. Barrows left the president's office and went into her own, shutting the door. It wasn't until half an hour later that Mr. Fitweiler sent for Mr. Martin. The head of the filing department, neat, quiet, attentive, stood in front of the old man's desk. Mr. Fitweiler was pale and nervous. He took his glasses off and twiddled them. He made a small ruffing sound in his throat. "Martin," he said, "you have been with us more than 20 years. 22, sir," said Mr. Martin. "In that time," pursued the president, "your work and your manner have been exemplary." "I trust so, sir," said Mr. Martin. "I have understood, Martin," said Mr. Fitweiler, "that you have never taken a drink or smoked." "That's correct, sir," said Mr. Martin. Yes." Mr. Fitweiler polished his glasses. "You may describe what you did after leaving the office yesterday, Martin," he said. Mr. Martin allowed less than a second for his bewildered pause. "Certainly, sir," he said. "I walked home. Then I went to Shraft's for dinner. Afterward, I walked home again. I went to bed early, sir, and read a magazine for a while. I was asleep before 11. Yes," said Mr. Fitweiler again. He was silent for a moment, searching for the proper words to say to the head of the filing department. "Mrs. Barrows," he said finally, "Mrs. Barrows has worked hard, Martin, very hard. It grieves me to report that she has suffered a severe breakdown. It has taken the form of a persecution complex, accompanied by distressing hallucinations." "Very sorry, sir," said Mr. Martin. "Mrs. Barrows is under the delusion," continued Mr. Fitweiler, "that you visited her last evening and behaved yourself in an unseemly manner." He raised his hand to silence Mr. Martin's little pained outcry. "It is the nature of these psychological diseases," Mr. Fitweiler said, "to fix upon the least likely and most innocent party as the source of persecution. These matters are not for the lay mind to grasp, Martin. I've just had my psychiatrist, Dr. Fitch, on the phone. He would not, of course, commit himself, but he made enough generalizations to substantiate my suspicions. I suggested to Mrs. Barrows, when she had completed her story to me this morning, that she visit Dr. Fitch, for I suspected a condition at once. She flew, I regret to say, into a rage and requested that I call you on the carpet. You may not know, Martin, but Mrs. Barrows had planned a reorganization of your department, subject to my approval, of course, subject to my approval. This brought you, rather than anyone else, to her mind, but again, that is a phenomenon for Dr. Fitch, not for us. So, Martin, I am afraid Mrs. Barrows' usefulness here is at an end." "I am dreadfully sorry, sir," said Mr. Martin. It was at this point that the door to the office blew open with the suddenness of a gas main explosion, and Mrs. Barrows catapulted through it. "Is the little rat denying it?" she screamed. "He can't get away with that." Mr. Martin got up and moved discreetly to a point beside Mr. Fitweiler's chair. You drank and smoked at my apartment, she bawled at Mr. Martin. And you know it. You called Mr. Fitweiler an old windbag and said you were going to blow him up when you got coked to the gills on your heroin. She stopped yelling to catch her breath, and a new glint came into her popping eyes. If you weren't such a drab, ordinary little man, she said, I'd think you'd planned it. Sticking your tongue out, saying you were sitting in the catbird seat because you thought no one would believe me when I told it. My God, it's really too perfect. She brayed loudly and hysterically, and the fury was on her again. She glared at Mr. Fitweiler. Can't you see how he's tricked us, you old fool? Can't you see his little game? But Mr. Fitweiler had been surreptitiously pressing all the buttons under the top of his desk, and employees of F&S began pouring into the room. Stockton, said Mr. Fitweiler, you and Fishbein will take Mrs. Barrows to her home. Mrs. Powell, you will go with them. Stockton, who had played a little football in high school, blocked Mrs. Barrows as she made for Mr. Martin. It took him and Fishbein together to force her out of the door, into the hall, crowded with stenographers and office boys. She was still screaming imprecations at Mr. Martin, tangled and contradictory imprecations. The hubbub finally died out down the corridor. I regret that this has happened, said Mr. Fitweiler. I shall ask you to dismiss it from your mind, Martin. Yes, sir, Mr. Martin said, anticipating his chiefs. That will be all, by moving to the door. I will dismiss it. He went out and shut the door, and his step was light and quick in the hall. When he entered his department, he had slowed down to his customary gait, and he walked quietly across the room to the W-20 file, wearing a look of studious concentration. The Catbird Seat by James Thurber. And now imagine that as a movie, please, starring Peter Sellers as Mr. Martin, set in a distillery in Scotland. Hope you enjoyed it. I'm Keith Olbermann. See you on Countdown.